Hello and a very warm welcome to this brand new edition of the WION-VOA Co-Production. My name is Molly Gambhir. During a speech in Jakarta, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called on China to stop quote-unquote aggressive actions in the Indo-Pacific region. But Beijing has already rejected Blinken's assertions. VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain getting us this report.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with his Malaysian counterpart, Foreign Minister Saifuddin Abdullah, before announcing he would not be able to hold meetings in Thailand as planned out of an abundance of caution. The U.S. Embassy in Kuala Lumpur said a member of the delegation tested positive for COVID-19 and that Blinken and the rest of the group would be traveling home. The February military coup in Myanmar was high on the agenda for talks Wednesday, with Blinken saying the situation in the country has gotten much worse since the coup. He condemned violence against protesters and said the U.S. is considering more sanctions on Rangoon's military junta.
I think it's going to be very important in the weeks and months ahead to look at what additional steps and measures we can take individually, collectively, to pressure the regime to put the country back on a democratic trajectory.
Blinken repeated his calls for the junta to immediately release all political prisoners, including democracy leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Myanmar would also have been a critical issue of talks in Thailand, expert Brian Harding told VOA, because of its common border with Myanmar, formerly known as Burma.
Thailand has more influence in Myanmar, both in the capital with the military junta and also on the borderlands that where the ethnic armed organizations within Myanmar are located and the National Unity Government, the democratic representatives. I think the issue of humanitarian assistance across the border, COVID vaccines, the situation with internally displaced people, the situation in Myanmar since the coup in February 1st has really had negative impacts for Thailand. There are people, drugs, crime flowing across the border.
Blinken began the Asia part of the trip in Indonesia, where he called on China to stop what he characterized as aggressive actions in the South China Sea and the region. Harding said countries in the Indo-Pacific are watching the tensions between China and the U.S. with concern.
They worry about the deterioration of U.S.-China relations, whether it could lead to active conflicts such as in the South China Sea. And so Southeast Asian countries like to see the United States and China talking. They're okay with a healthy competition, but there is concern that things could spiral downward in an uncontrollable way.
As frequent confrontations with Chinese vessels continue in the disputed South China Sea, Blinken made clear the U.S. wants to ensure people and countries in the region have the freedom to decide on their own futures and partners. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
And to speak about this further, joining us on the broadcast is Voice of America correspondent Jessica Stone from Washington. Hi, Jessica. We heard Secretary Blinken try and separate the U.S. from China as a partner to Southeast Asian countries that will respect human rights. What evidence, though, is there in Washington that lawmakers are determined to make good on that pledge?
Well, I think you can look at the speed with which the Uyghur Forced Labor Act was passed this week in Washington as good evidence that there is a lot of support building here in Washington towards a more hawkish view of China, certainly on human rights. You know, we saw it pass the House on Tuesday. We saw it pass unanimously the Senate on Wednesday. That is very quick work for anything that happens up on Capitol Hill. And this bill, of course, creates sanctions for any company's supply chain that deals with forced labor in Xinjiang. This could be sugar, it could be cotton. And we saw a lot of lobbying by major multinationals, including Coca-Cola and Nike, against this bill. The administration did have some hesitation about pushing forward with this bill, but now we fully expect President Biden to sign it. And it comes in the same week that we saw the U.S. also blacklist about 36 Chinese technology companies, among them DJI, which is the technology drone company, the Chinese drone company that actually makes the drones that are frequently used to surveil the Uyghurs themselves. And all of this ahead of the announced last week Olympic boycott. That, of course, means that Washington will send its athletes, but not its diplomats, to the Winter Games.
Right. Jessica, a Hong Kong study just released shows that the Sinovac vaccine does not provide sufficient antibodies to neutralize the Omicron variant. Now, that's a huge concern. What does this mean for the billions around the world who have already gotten that shot?
Well, yeah, it really is a significant development, especially for the developing world, because this is where most people have gotten Sinovac or Sinopharm. It's because both of these manufacturers of the COVID-19 vaccine don't require very cold storage. It's very easy to store their vaccines. That's why it's been so easy to distribute throughout the developing world. And what the study says is that the Sinovac vaccine is about 50% effective, that Sinopharm is 78% effective, and they are recommending that anyone who has gotten either of those vaccines get an additional one as a booster, especially as we go into a season where we're now seeing Omicron take over from Delta in terms of the variants. But one caution on Omicron, and that is this. We are not seeing evidence yet that it is more lethal. It is certainly more contagious than Delta and the previous variants. But we also know that as viruses evolve, they typically become less virulent. And so if we see that with Omicron, it certainly will be something more encouraging. That said, everyone here in the United States and around the world continues to be encouraged by their public health officials to get that booster.
Right. Stay with me, Jessica. Let's also get our viewers the latest coming in as far as America's climate crisis is concerned. From rising seas in Miami to devastating wildfires in California, climate change is putting more and more American communities at risk. And as the risks intensify, many are finding that the best option may be to retreat before disaster strikes. Just 70 kilometers southwest of New Orleans, the first federally funded climate relocation is underway. WIO's Steve Baragona reporting.
A thin strip of asphalt is all that connects Isle de Jean Charles to the Louisiana coast.
The island cemetery?
Chris Brunet's Native American ancestors fled to these remote marshes in the 1800s to escape white settlers.
We've been over here for generations, and so since we are Native Americans, we are tied to the land.
But that land is eroding into the Gulf of Mexico. Isle de Jean Charles has shrunk 98% since the 1950s. Canals for oil and gas drilling and pipelines have eaten away land across coastal Louisiana. Climate change is dealing the final blow as rising seas accelerate the erosion. Brunet has spent his whole life on Isle de Jean Charles, but he says the shrinkage of his island home forced his hand.
It causes people to make decisions they don't want to make, and they're almost forced to make that decision because of climate change.
Where we're walking right now will be houses in less than a year.
Pat Forbes heads Louisiana's Office of Community Development. His office oversees a $48 million federal grant to relocate island residents to this new community about 55 kilometers northwest.
While we hate that we have to do this to create this opportunity, we're glad that we can.
The grant from the Federal Housing Agency, called HUD, is the first to resettle a community threatened by climate change, but likely not the last, as more and more people flee climate disasters, Forbes says.
HUD wanted us to do something that helps all of us learn how to do this better, because there's going to be a lot of it going on.
The project is unique in another way, he adds.
All we've ever done in the past, for the most part, is give people money to go find a house somewhere. And when you do that, the whole community falls apart. Spreads out all over the place.
That's always good.
Nearly all of the close-knit community of Isle de Jean Charles will relocate together. Brunet's niece and nephew will join him when the development is finished sometime in 2022. Experts say community can be as important to people as safety. Still, Brene faces the move with mixed feelings.
It's like uprooting a tree and moving it some other place, and you can only hope that the roots from that tree is going to take into that new ground. That's how I am. You're building me a house, but it's not my home yet.
Uprooted by climate change, experts say more and more people will be forced to build not just new houses, but new homes. Steve Baragona, VOA News, Isle de Jean Charles, Louisiana.
And going back across to Voice of America correspondent Jessica Stone, who's with us from Washington. Jessica, the impact of climate change comes up every time we witness a natural disaster like the one the state of Kentucky recently also faced, where a tornado wiped out towns and neighborhoods. Tell us more about the recovery efforts in the American Midwest as of now.
Well, this was just an absolutely record-breaking, terrible storm. I mean, they have now come back to us from the National Weather Service and told us that there were wind gusts up to 300 kilometers per hour going on with this tornado. So you can just imagine the damage here. We saw President Biden visiting on Wednesday, touring the damage, meeting the people who have been so devastated, losing their entire homes, all of their possessions, and really giving the message which they needed to hear, that the government will help them out. And that's especially important because these folks do not live in major metropolitan areas where they have a lot of access to services. They needed to hear that from their president. And just to give you a piece of the devastation, I mean, they do not have IDs. Many of these people have lost everything. No driver's licenses, credit cards, checkbooks, anything to prove who they are. That means it's difficult to get a hotel room. It means it's difficult to get any kind of loan or even access to their finances. And so what the president has done is declared an emergency disaster zone, and that's going to release millions of dollars from the federal government to get to these folks to help provide food, shelter, and other things that they need, short-term loans, especially for the business owners. That's really key, because what we're seeing right now is that there are about 90 people that have been counted as dead, most of them in the state of Kentucky, Molly. But we're also seeing the deaths continue as people engage in the cleanup. I mean, just imagine the emotional toll that it's taking and the physical toll. We just saw a heart attack, for example, this week. That's also to an older man that has, just been trying to clean up his home.
Right, and in terms of climate action, we are learning that the White House's second climate investment push appears to be on hold. What does that mean for America's commitment to combating climate change?
Well, I think for the folks watching, it can be a little confusing. We've had two infrastructure bills now, right? One that has passed, which had some climate resilience funding in it, but the one that has not passed, that we believe now will be delayed, that is a $2.2 trillion bill, and it has $500 million, $500 billion in climate resilience funding. And a lot of that is for electric vehicles, the kind President Biden recently toured in Detroit. He drove an electric Hummer. And these are also for tax credits, for other kinds of resilience efforts, carbon capture. And all of these measures are part of a big package of social spending that's still being opposed by a key senator from the state of West Virginia, which is a major coal state. And it looks as though unless he pulls his opposition, this is not going to pass this year. That pushes it into March. And that means that some of the climate commitments that President Biden made at COP26, including the U.S.'s commitment to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030, are very much in jeopardy unless that bill gets passed, Molly.
Right, well, we're leaving it there for the moment. Jessica Stone, thanks very much for getting us those updates from Washington. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of the WION-VOA Co-Production.